Thank you very much for tuning in this morning. So today, in commemoration of the International Sign Language Day, we are going to interrogate how we can promote inclusivity in education by advocating and empowering sign language in Namibia and in our education system. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dorothea Nangolo, and today I'm joined in studio by Mr. Paul Linekela Nenyani, who's the Executive Director of Namibia National Association of the Deaf. We're also joined by Ms. Lizette Bucas, a Senior Education Officer at the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture. We are also joined by Mr. Ndiwe Ndlovu, who is the NANSO Secretary of Gender, Disability, Marginalized Communities and Social Welfare. So tomorrow, as we commemorate the International Sign Language Day, we are not only advocating for awareness around sign language, but we are also actively advocating for the need to recognize and include sign language in our education system and foster the rights of the deaf. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined by a brilliant set of guests today. So Ms. Bucas, perhaps run us through this year's International Sign Language Day theme. So this year's theme is a world where deaf people everywhere can sign anywhere. Please run us through the importance of this theme.
Thank you, Dorothea. I just wanted to say that this theme, when I first saw it, it actually links very well of what happened last week. The Honorable Alexia Kube, she handed in a motion that to Parliament that Namibian Sign Language should be recognized as one of the national languages in Namibia. And I mean, that needs to be applauded for. And it links so well with our theme. And the thing that stands out for me, it's sign anywhere and everywhere. Meaning that talks about access, isn't it? And it talks about breaking down those barriers and to enhance inclusivity. So I think it's an excellent theme for where we are now currently in Namibia.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bucas. We're also joined in studio today by our sign language interpreter, Ms. Selma. Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am. So I think my next question is to you, Mr. Paul. When we look at sign language, I think for most of us, we barely understand sign language on its own, and we think it's just, a way of using our body language or using words. What is sign language, and is it universal? Is it the same everywhere across the world?
Good morning. Thank you so much for the question. Sign language is what we call Namibian Sign Language. It's a language that is distinctly on its own. It has its grammar, it has syntax, it can express ideas, emotions, how we feel, what we love, we can sing. Sign language is actually a language that is standing on its own with all its features. So each country has its own sign language. But I think there are more than 200 sign languages across the country, across the world rather. So the International Sign Language are actually now combined with different signs from each country, and then we combine that and make it International Sign Language. So for us to get to know one another. And then there's a national sign language that depends on a culture or on a country. Their people that they have, then they establish their own national sign language. But it's a language on its own. So we are now demanding government to recognize sign language just to be on par with other national languages in our country. We want to equally to be on the same status as other languages in Namibia. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul. I think you mentioned that we have over 200 different sign languages. Perhaps just give us an example of one of the sign languages that are different from Namibia's one.
Okay, for example, we in Namibia, we say name. We sign name. In America, they sign name. So you can see that the two signs are different, right? Namibia if you sign this in Namibia, you're saying toilet or bathroom rather. In America, they say T for bathroom. And that's how each country has its own signs or its own sign language.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Paul. I think over to you, Tandiwe. Perhaps speak to us. We understand that schools play a very crucial role in the development of learners, be it academically, socially, and psychologically. From NANSO's perspective, what challenges have you identified that deaf learners are experiencing at basic education level?
Okay. Thank you so much for the question, Dorothea. Perhaps I think one of the biggest concerns is obviously access to education. And this is primarily because we only have a handful of schools in Namibia that can cater for those who are deaf. So we think that when addressing this issue, that is one of the things that we need to look at. Not that it should only be specific schools that can accommodate learners who are deaf, but that many schools in Namibia should be able to do that. That's one. But number two, we think also inclusivity in terms of like extracurricular activities. Because when we speak of education, it's important for us to look at a holistic component. We need to look at socially as well. Do we ever see learners who participate in debate, for example, from sign language? Do they participate in science fair, for example? These are some of the challenges that as NANSO we've identified. But I think the greatest challenge, and it's something that puzzles me, is back to the issue of inclusivity, is a question of what happens to learners who leave school and where do they further their studies? Where do deaf learners further their studies? I, for example, am a student at the Namibia University of Science and Technology, but also earlier in this year, we did an assessment during our Access to Education campaign, and we came to a conclusion that universities specifically, or institutions of higher learning rather, are not friendly towards those who live with disabilities. So I think just in a nutshell, those are some of the challenges that we've observed as NANSO as far as deaf learners are concerned.
Tandiwe, you spoke about how through your Access to Education campaign, you've identified that most of the schools are not inclusive to learners living with disabilities. But specifically, most of the schools don't offer sign language. How do you think NANSO is trying to address the issue of inclusivity? Because you realize that in a region, for instance, only one school is offering sign language, and there are only a few teachers there. So the situation then, my question is, so in a situation where a learner or the teacher who's offering sign language only teaches accounting, so the learner who speaks sign language or who uses sign language to communicate, are they forced to do accounting? What alternatives are there for them?
Okay. Thank you for that question, Dorothea. You highlight something that's very important. I think in terms of addressing this, how we address this particular issue is by engaging government. It's having conversations such as this, because this discourse is what's important in order for us to create an environment where learners who are deaf can thrive. So when you highlight the issue of the teachers, it's quite important, because it's a question that we ask ourselves, is that do we have teachers who are adequately trained to be able to teach in sign language? Can physics teachers teach in sign language? Can mathematics teachers teach in sign language? And when we have these questions, I think this is where we engage government, we engage the ministries, and see how can we map a way of being able to incorporate this into our school system. But then also we need to recognize that this is a problem that is actually quite bigger, because when you think of, oh, this needs to be in school, but however, we don't even have sign language as a recognized language in Namibia to begin with. I think that would be a starting point for it to be recognized, for learners to be taught sign language from an early age, to be taught in school. Can other learners who can hear communicate with those who are deaf, for example, is the beginning of this particular conversation.
Thank you so much, Tandiwe. Ms. Bukes, I think Tandiwe has highlighted some of the challenges at basic education, right? I think from the ministry's perspective, speak to us about some of the challenges, number one, but also the ways in which the ministry has tried to resolve some of these challenges, and what is the way forward, or the plan from the ministry side, how we can include sign language and ensure that our schools are more inclusive, especially when it comes to deaf learners.
Thank you, Tandiwe. Quite a mouthful, eh? Yes, it is and remain a challenge. If you talk, I think the first thing that I want to talk a little bit about is access. And many times we think, if you think of children with learners with disabilities, you think access, oh, let's build ramps. And so that for the deaf learner, the access challenge is different. Okay, and you've mentioned quite a few. But the main thing that I can say that, and I want to applaud the Ministry of Education in the sense, is that we actually avail schools that can include learners that are deaf. And currently there's about only 4 in Namibia. If I talk about, I say, this is specifically your secondary schools that have learners from grade 8 to grade 11. We call them the inclusive schools. Of course, the challenge now is that you cannot just place a deaf learner at a school What are the things that need to be in place before? And that is where the ministry, for example, now employ what we call interpreters. Like you see Selma doing an excellent job that she's doing. She's breaching now the communication between the deaf and the hearing, and that is what is needed. And I can applaud the Ministry of Education for appointing and establishing those posts through OPM that we have interpreters on board. The other challenge, of course, is like you've mentioned, do we have a teacher or interpreter that is fluent in, that can interpret science, mathematics? Those subjects are not easy, like I can say, like I would do English or any other. Those are the very difficult. It's actually, I never would want to be a math interpreter, for example. We do have our interpreters trained now at NAMCOL. I think 5 of them completed the course now. So let's rather look at the positive side and say there is light at the tunnel, the end of the tunnel. So it's not as if we are just sitting and we are seeing the need and the ministry is acting on it. Access, of course, you talk about extramural activities. We would love our learners to take, and that's why I can see the audience is quite also a few deaf learners here. This is the things that we mean. Expose them, give them opportunities to see what can be done and what are hearing people doing. You talk about the debate. I think our deaf learners are not included when it comes to debate and things like that. Science fairs, I know some of them do. It's introduced by the teachers, for example, at school. But access, it's beyond just looking at the buildings. Access for our deaf, it's basically communication. The communication need of our deaf learners, that remains the biggest challenge. Yeah, but like I said, we have the interpreters at schools now. Yeah, what else do we have? Then also, I think you touch on the curriculum specifically. I would love, and I think this is something that we are busy working on now. Currently, what we have in the system now, we only have the sign language curriculum to be offered to deaf learners. In other words, sign language as a subject. But as we are now waiting on the ministry to approve sign language as, as a official national language, then also to introduce sign language at all schools.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about access, if Mr. Nanyeni wants to go to the hospital, health services, to the shops, to the police, it would be excellent if everybody could, know the basic sign language to communicate. And not even just to talk about, we talk about access, but what happens at home? We send our kids off without us as parents knowing sign language. So you could see it's not just one ministry. I think it's a holistic, like you said, holistic approach. Everybody should, add a little bit something, starting from the parents already, going to school. So that for me, access to information, access to communication, it already starts to, access to education, it already starts at home. And our deaf learners, unfortunately, because there is no communication, the barrier already starts there at home. So just imagine what their life would be like. But you are right saying that there is still a lot that we can do as a Ministry of Education, but I also want to applaud the ministry for what they've done thus far. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, Ms. Bukas. I think, Mr. Paul, now that we've identified some of the challenges that deaf learners are experiencing at basic education and all the way to tertiary education, from the Namibia National Association of the Deaf, what do you think are some of the agenda points you're pushing from your end, and how do you think we can address these challenges collectively as a country?
Okay, we are talking about the theme for this week, or worldwide, that we want deaf people that are signing everywhere. So we first want access. But access actually, for example, is for us a priority. Because if you look at the home setting, there's no sign language. Parents cannot even support their own children. And that already is really a misnomer. Now, deaf children, for example, when they are supposed to be taught in their mother tongue, which is sign language. So we want communication to actually start at home. So once the child is born in a hearing family, for instance, hearing families give birth to the deaf children, and then while a child is perhaps a baby, the mother cannot even communicate with the baby or with the child at home. the child gets to 5 to 6 years of age and then only start to learn sign language. And that's a little bit delayed development in language acquisition. So it's best that we have a program that is teaching parents sign language. We have one at NISE. I think we are working with Clash. We are teaching parents, every Saturday we are teaching parents sign language because we want them to develop and to be able to actually communicate with their children. That's the aim. The second point will be that we have a program that is teaching sign language. There are people that are interested to come learn sign language. We have a class for them. And then perhaps in future, once they have acquired the fluency in sign language, they perhaps go to NAMCOL and then be trained as interpreters. So once we've got interpreters in our country, we can then talk about improved access to universities. That we have, because currently there are no interpreters at the University of Namibia or any other college of higher education. So we're thinking about when we talk about deaf people, we actually need that we have got interpreters as well along deaf people. So we are focusing on actually training more interpreters in our country. For us, that is important. We want to thank CCDS for having a training of interpreters that are aiming at making more interpreters, people become more interpreters in our country. That wherever deaf people are, they are interpreters and they're also signing everywhere. So whether I'm at the hospital, whether I'm at Parliament, I want to say sign language. Wherever we are, anywhere, there should be an interpreter or there should be sign language. Now we have got 5 interpreters in our country. If you take 4 away, or you put 4 in school, we are left with 1. And the whole country, just 1 interpreter that is running around, interpreting everywhere. It's really a challenge because there's so many, there's no interpreters that are left in our country. So we have got a limited number of interpreters in our country, and I think the best way is for us to actually train more, and then once there are no interpreters in our country, we are left with deaf people that are not able to access anything. We have experience on how to teach perhaps theory, but many times when we're in the classroom, we cannot actually just theorize without having sign language there. So we need to teach in a manner that if someone is saying it in theoretical aspect, there's also someone that can perhaps sign what the teacher is saying to the deaf learners. Once we accept a deaf child, there should be an interpreter and a teacher that are working together to actually try and improve life for this deaf child. So once we've got interpreters in our country, it means that we have got our languages recognized as well. We have got more resources. We actually need funding from government to train interpreters. And then we can achieve much, much more when it comes to accessibility. Because right now, if the status quo remains, I think it will just remain as is if we don't change anything.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul. I think Mr. Paul mentioned that it's very important that children from a very young age, deaf children from a very young age, are exposed to learning about sign language. Perhaps Ms. Buka, speak to us about early childhood education. Is there sign language available at that level of education? And because you did mention that most of the schools that offer sign language are high schools, do we have sign language teachers at that level of education?
Thank you, Dorothea. Yeah, that is something that I wanted to say earlier, that it's the focus on sign language. It's like I said, it started at home. Then we are also very fortunate that although the sign language is not yet recognized as one of the national languages, but I can also say that it's approved as a medium of instruction at all our schools where deaf learners are enrolled. In other words, all our teachers are required to be proficient in sign language. I can remember when I was a teacher at the school, it was compulsory back in the days that we had to attend sign language classes with the Association for the Deaf from January to the day before Christmas. That is the day that you would stop. We had a very strict principle back then. So that helped us to become very proficient in sign language, and that is a need. If the teacher can sign, then there can be communication. But something else that because of the lack of access to sign language at home, the Ministry of Education appointed or established what we call teacher deaf assistants. So in your junior primary phase, we have then a class assistant that is deaf. And the reason for that, it is because of the language development. Those children still need to learn the basic. They come to school without knowing that they have a name. So this is where communication starts, and that is why the ministry saw the need to appoint a deaf teacher assistant so that there can be communication, the link that is missing so that it can be fulfilled in class. So currently, all our schools for the deaf, the resource schools for the deaf, they have, and even the units, they include our younger learners.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think, Thandiwe, one thing that comes out very strongly from our discussions now is the need to nationalize Namibian Sign Language. What is NANSO's position in this regard?
Okay. At the Congress that we had last year, as NANSO, we made a very deliberate decision that in our advocacy, one of the biggest things that we're advocating for is inclusivity. So we need to recognize that we cannot speak about inclusivity if we do not take into account learners that live with disabilities. When we don't take into account those who are deaf, those who are blind, those that use wheelchairs, for example. So because of that decision that we made at Congress, we've put deliberate efforts in trying to see how can we achieve this goal. And I think it's very important then for us to say that as NANSO, we are for the nationalizing of sign language. This is to say that our stance as NANSO is that from basic education, every single learner, regardless of whether they are deaf or not, should be taught sign language. Why is this important, Dorothea? This is very important because we need to understand that communication is very important in schools, and we cannot integrate people who are deaf into the general community if those who can hear cannot sign, for example. So we think that it's important that from a young age, starting from pre-primary, for example, Namibian learners should be taught how to sign, and this will help for them to be able to communicate with those who cannot hear. Yeah, so I think our position is quite clear, and that is to say that we are advocating for incorporation of sign language at basic education level for all learners.
We are aware that there's a very huge gap between learners from basic education who make it to tertiary education. There's a gap there, and most of our learners fall within the cracks, and especially with our deaf learners. Speak to us about how, as a country or as NANSO, you can address that situation where you have majority of our deaf learners, unfortunately, do not make it to higher education, tertiary education, or to vocational institutions.
Yeah. Okay. As NANSO, the decision that we've taken is to engage the various stakeholders that are involved. That is to bring you back again to the Access to Education campaign that we had earlier in the year. We engaged different institutions of higher learning just to find out what exactly is the problem, because we see so many learners who, for example, the learners that are present here, they are deaf, but we don't see so many people, so many of them in university, and we think that that is something that concerns us so much. We also, for instance, if we look at those who live with other disabilities, we see so many of them in schools, but then the question still remains, what happens to them? Where do they go after basic education? And that is something that we've identified as a concern, and this is why we continue to engage different stakeholders as NANSO, because we believe that this is not a task or a job that is only for government. It is not a task or a job that's only for NANSO, but we believe that if we can work together, engage and find out what are the problems, how can we solve these problems. A lot of times it could just be perhaps that it's something that we don't think about very often, maybe because we don't encounter people who are deaf very often, or we don't encounter people who live with disabilities very often, and we tend to overlook these things. So as NANSO, we serve as a reminder to say, this is the challenge, how can we fix it? And we think that by creating this particular discourse, we're able to then work together with different stakeholders and see how can we put different solutions in place to achieve an education system that is inclusive for all, regardless.
Thank you so much. I think, Mr. Powell, my question to you is, since the inception of the Namibia National Association of the Deaf, we've been celebrating Deaf Awareness Month in the month of September. Please speak to us from inception till now. What are some of the significant challenges you've experienced as an organization, and what are some of the important moments that you can be proud of as an organization, and some of the accomplishments you've made thus far?
Thank you. Deaf Awareness Week is a very important week where we celebrate, essentially to advocate for and to try and remove the barriers or challenges that we are facing as deaf people. And NAD was established in 1991. And we actually have been facing a lot of challenges as an association. Sometimes you've got students that are going from grade 1 up until grade 10, and then they have nowhere to go. And then they sort of fall in the system. And then they go to a HAFO, and then they get a bit of training to do welding or woodwork. But then we looked at it and thought that perhaps access to education, to higher education, should be actually be resolved. And we involved other stakeholders. We discussed with them to try and change the status quo. So what we have observed is that before there were no interpreters in our country. So many times we will go to a meeting or we go to a gathering, you have to write back and forth. So we fought and advocated for training of interpreters. And then eventually there was a TV interpreter as well. So at least we have got now access to the news as deaf people. We achieved that. Now, but we also have other challenges that the limited number of interpreters in our country was also now another challenge. So we looked for sponsorship from different associations to train interpreters. So we spoke to NTA, and I think they gave us now funding to train interpreters in our country. We have been training them now, but unfortunately we have people that are participating more are teachers in the training. So now when you're a teacher and also select an interpreter, it becomes a bit of a challenge because sometimes you're in school and then you can't go and interpret when need arises. So we are now trying to fight to say that maybe if you are writing exams and you must actually have got 25 points that you can pass and go to grade 11. We thought, but how possible is it for a deaf child to really acquire these points? Or how are we are not actually we are being assessed equally like a hearing student, for example. So we were negotiating and trying to advocate for perhaps lesser requirements for a deaf child. Because mind you, a deaf child has to be in class, look at the interpreter, look at the teacher, try to take down notes. So we thought maybe we can minimize the requirements and perhaps only have grade English and then be able to access grade 11. So perhaps we can then, we thought that if a child passes grade 10 and then has got 20 points, they can then continue to grade 11. But then the inclusive education policy says that, we have to go to, so we have got 2 inclusive schools, that is now Cosmos, Moshipandeka, Haimbilia Ofiku. They've actually now taken in deaf students. There's also one school in Rundu and another one, I think, Maria Mwengere. Yes, that have got actually deaf students there. So we went to Swakop, we established one school that are also now accommodating deaf students. Yes. So it's our hope then that this gets more and deaf kids get accepted to many schools across the country. But we also want to fight for employment opportunities for deaf children, for deaf people, for deaf adults. Many times you find that they are hardly employed or they hardly get employment. Maybe 1 or 2 gets an employment here. So we are trying to talk to fishing companies and try and see whether they can recruit deaf adults. We spoke to Omwalu fishing company because they have actually now employed a lot of deaf people. We want to thank Omwalu fishing company for employing a lot of deaf people. So many times we send them their CVs and then they recruit 2 or 3 deaf adults, and then that's how we are gaining access to employment for deaf adults. So now we are trying to focus on actually government to see whether government can employ a few deaf in their structures. Maybe at the managerial level, because we hardly see deaf people at managerial positions in government. Because we also want to feel proud to say, okay, there's a deaf adult who's in a senior level position, but to just remain as a cleaner, for instance, for a number of years is really demoralizing for other deaf people. So we want to see them also, climbing the ladder in government structures. Not only those that are deaf, but also any other type of disability that we want to see at management level. So that ought to change. We're hoping our government changes that status quo. NNAD has actually achieved a few achievements since its establishment. We are happy with what we have achieved so far. We have involved different stakeholders to try and help deaf people in our country. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul. I think one thing that is very strong is there is a need to ensure that our education is inclusive to learners that are deaf and ensuring that sign language is offered in our schools. We're also pushing for the fact that there is also a need to ensure that our schools, most of our schools are at least inclusive. I believe, Ms. Bukes, the vision is at least someday all our schools in Namibia can be inclusive to learners that are deaf and to learners that are living with various disabilities. However, when we look at inclusivity and including sign language as well in our education, in our curriculum, and in various schools across the country, there's a very big question on the quality of education that is being offered. Perhaps walk us through how to ensure at the end of the day that there's quality education that's being delivered in sign language and that our learners that are learning through sign language are up to standard and they have the exact same understanding that an ordinary learner or learner who can hear has at the end of the day.
I think, Dorothea, that is a question that you should actually ask our deaf learners because they are the ones on the receiving side. I can say from a Ministry of Education point of view, I can say, yes, we deliver excellent and quality education, but I think that question should actually be posed to learners and to the deaf community. How do they experience education? And that is, all that I can say on that one is that that is in our mandate, that we say that we provide access to education, quality education, and that's why we have interpreters in place, and that's why we are making sure that the curriculum is there for the deaf and things like that. But the question that you asked should actually be addressed to a deaf learner because they are on the receiving end and not me. I'm the one giving. So it would be good if we can hear from the deaf and see what do they think, whether it's quality education. But from our side, we do everything that we possibly can to make it accessible to them and to always deliver quality of education. Yeah.
Perhaps looking at the education in itself, do you think we have sufficient resources in terms of the necessary textbooks or learning and teaching materials available to assist our learners in this regard?
Can I say, will we ever have enough, and will we ever have enough access to resources? Resources remains a challenge, but in this case, I can also say this is where we have international, stakeholders like the UN, like UNICEF, and them. They are really supporting us when it comes to material. At the Ministry of Education, we've established what we call the Center for Communication and Deaf Studies, where I am fortunate to be at, and with my deaf colleagues, and we are responsible for developing material. Now, it is, our learners use the same, our deaf learners follow the same curriculum as all other learners, hearing learners, and it's also, they follow, everything the same, and they use the same textbooks. We don't have a textbook that everything is in sign, so it's required of them to be able to read English. Okay. The only difference with the curriculum is when we do sign language and English, whereas the other learners can do English with another language. So what textbooks and everything is concerned, we use the same. And then we try at our department or division, let me rather say division, to develop as much as possible material for the deaf.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Tandiwe, we've had such a brilliant discussion today from NANSO. Why do you think it was necessary to have this conversation today?
Okay. As NANSO, the biggest thing that necessitated this conversation would obviously be that gap that we identified between the learners that we have in school and those that actually make it to university. But I think also hearing from the panel, looking at it from a broader perspective, it would be also the absorption of these people into the market. I think when we speak of education and when we speak of quality education, one of the things that I believe is a good matrix to use to measure whether education is of quality is what happens to you after you've been educated. Is the economy able to absorb you? What happens to these learners after that? And what necessitated this conversation is to say that these people, can they then be able to make meaningful contribution to the economy? And I think as NANSO, one of the reasons why we are also advocating that everyone be able to sign is because, for instance, you might say that as a deaf person, you went to school, you got education, but companies might be hesitant to employ you, and that is because they will struggle to understand you. So I think that when we fix this problem, and I believe that we can fix this problem if we incorporate sign language from a young age, that is to say that everyone who enters into school should be able to sign, that in return raises adults or people within the work industry that are able to communicate with those that sign as an effect. People who sign are able to be absorbed into the job market. So what really, really necessitated this is really to assess the gap. What is the issue and how can we close that gap between those that we have as our learners and those that actually make it to university? How can we make education inclusive? Because as NANSO, if these are not the things that we are looking for, we think that we then don't serve our mandate, which is inclusive education for all.
Thank you so much, Tandiwe. Mr. Paul, as we prepare to celebrate International Sign Language Day tomorrow on the 23rd of September, what does this year's theme mean to the community in terms of evaluating how far we are as a country and as a world in terms of achieving a world where it's inclusive for people that are deaf, and a world where sign language is included is included and recognized as a national language? How far are we?
Tomorrow, the theme is, like we said, a world where deaf people can sign anyway. It's actually a very important theme that includes sign language. So international sign language is actually, the UN actually looks at the end and decides what theme will be for that year. So we want a world that sees or views sign language as sign language is a language. I explained that we have got more than 200 sign languages across the country. We shouldn't just ignore them. We must accept these languages, and then that's why we are celebrating the day tomorrow. So tomorrow, up until Sunday, we have got activities that we are going to teach sign language. We want everyone to be able to sign. Like all of us here, apart from Selma, the panel that are here should be able to actually sign. Everywhere and anywhere, we should be able to sign. So I can sit and just sign with you. That's our aim. And that means that if we can achieve that our Namibian house become inclusive. Right now, we are not really inclusive as a country. I can go to State House and maybe knock, and then people looking at you and saying, oh, everybody's just quiet and not be able to communicate with me. So that's what we're saying. We want, if I can knock State House or I can go to the hospital, wherever, I'm able to sign. Whether it's at home, in church, in the bank, the hospital, everywhere, I'm able to sign or access sign language. So, but our biggest challenge is perhaps when you apply and they want to employ you as a deaf person, they look at you and saying, you're a deaf person, but if I employ you, that means I must also have an interpreter along with you. 2 salaries? No, I'm not going to employ you. And that's a challenge. So we want to actually be able to sign everywhere. Whether I'm employed, my boss can sign with me, or colleagues are able to sign with me as well. So yesterday we actually had the theme for yesterday was putting deaf people on the agenda. That is very important, and I'm going to explain why. So we are deaf people in our country. Many times when we are debating, when we are interacting, when we are communicating, deaf people are nowhere to be seen. There's no sign language. So Parliament actually is busy with a motion that is debating regarding, that affects all people. So now, for us, we are always left behind. We are always marginalized. They decide, and then perhaps tomorrow you realize they've made a decision and you've broken the law or you've gone against the law because you are not aware that the law was just passed in Parliament. Remember that access that says about what law? Because for a deaf person, we have missed most of the information that was happening in Parliament. So these laws that are being passed also passes us by in the meantime. So we are raising awareness to say we want to actually be included, and we want this or some of these things to happen for the environment to actually be conducive for the deaf people. But our biggest problem is that many people, deaf people cannot hear. But the problem is that hearing people don't want to hear us. It's not that deaf people cannot hear, but the problem is that hearing people do not want to hear us. So I can be signing so loud and informing you properly, but then you will be just, ignoring what I'm saying. And that's the challenge. I'm informing you, but you don't want to hear what I'm saying. That's where the problem is. So we are now trying to say, deaf people, can you please, we are trying to let the hearing world, can you please start hearing us or listening to us? And then the environment become conducive for everyone. It's our hope that this week that everyone will actually be focusing on sign language. We want everyone to really support the motion and work with us from this day on so Namibia can become one Namibia house where it's very inclusive.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paulus. One thing that really stood out, like you said, is there's a very strong need for access to information for the deaf community, and a need for inclusivity in all other aspects, in all other industry, not just education. Perhaps, Ms. Bukas, as we wrap up our discussion today, please give us your final remarks in this regard.
I just want to reiterate what Paul said earlier. I think sign language is a beautiful language, and why don't we just embrace it? It's a very good language to know also. You know that you can gossip in sign language and the other person next to you wouldn't be able to tell. And you would just see the smiles on our faces because we were talking about you. But on a serious note, I think that sign language, like we are sitting here, it's actually bridging that gap between the hearing and the deaf. And that is what we want to Namibia to be like. We talk about inclusivity. We're talking about access. But how do we get it? Through sign language. I'm speaking now specifically about the deaf. We can only get that through sign language. And I also want to urge Nansu sitting here next to me, so you must also learn to sign. Please get everybody up in arms to learn sign language, because this is what we want as a deaf community, so that we have access, so that we don't always have to look for an interpreter to accompany us everywhere. You know, last week I was in a session where we had a counseling session. And it's not always nice to have a third party present when I want to share things from my heart with a counselor. And then there should be a third person. So if the counselor could sign, what a wonderful world would it be? So that is my something that I want to maybe just to urge the nation. Let's learn sign language and let's just sign. And we talk about inclusivity, but let's practice inclusivity as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tandiwe, from your side, what would you like to end off this discussion with?
I think my closing remarks would be that I'm very happy about the theme, because it's one that really just speaks to inclusivity. And I also will take it upon myself personally to learn sign language, because I think it's important really so that we bridge that gap between communication. And I think from that, a lot of other problems can be solved as far as inclusivity is concerned.
Thank you so much, Tandiwe. I think from the discussion, as stakeholders in education, as citizens as well, we've been given a way forward by our panelists that there is need to foster and push the agenda of inclusivity in our education system, but also ensuring that ourselves as individuals or as citizens, we're able to understand the language and we're able to communicate. I think by closing off, perhaps Mr. Paul, maybe you can teach us how to say thank you for watching in sign language.
I'm now a teacher. Yes, this is my passion. Okay, I'm happy to actually teach sign language. Sign language is my language. It's really, I'm passionate about sign language. So yesterday we were celebrating and we were, signing all the day. So that's how we say thank you. Now, are you left-handed or right-handed? Which one is your dominant hand? Okay, thank you for watching. So let me explain why there is thank you. Thank you for watching. That's actually English, né? If I say thank you for watching. But to sign, I say thank you for watching. Because the eyes are focusing at me, so I'm going to point the eyes as if I'm turning the eyes like this to show that your eyes are focused on me. We don't say I give you. We just say, in English, we say I give you. In sign language, just do shortly and say give. Thank you for watching. That's how we sign. Can you please come again? Can you please sign just what I showed you now?
All right, I think we can all sign. So it's thank you for watching. Amazing. Thank
Good.
you, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow. Well done.
All right, thank you so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. I think we can end off again with our new way of saying thank you. So it's thank you for watching. Amazing.